We're going to go over value proposition statement. We're going to use the scientific method. As I mentioned last time, I'm a molecular biologist by training. I really like to use the scientific method. I'm applying that to commercialization as well. We'll talk about customer discovery, and I'll give you some tips on doing interviews. So, a value proposition statement is an assertion, and I treat that assertion like a hypothesis. The assertion can look something like this, and this is typically the way I recommend people think about it. So, customers have a problem, and there's a proposed solution, that's the new commercial item, and it's better than the alternatives, which results in a compelling value. And in there, the underlined items, there are 4 key elements. Who are the customers? What is their problem? What's your solution, and why is that valuable? Right? So we're going to walk through each one of those things. Each one of them can be evaluated independently. You can collect data on them. For example, are there really customers that have this problem? Do they really care about the problem? Do they know they have this problem? Are there a lot of customers or not so many? Do the customers have the problem and care enough to actually do something and change their behavior? Your solution, does it address the problem? Is it attractive to the customers? And does the solution produce any value? What is that value? How do you measure the value? How can you calculate the commercial monetary measurement of that value? So, I'm not going to describe the scientific method to this audience, but you'll see how I've applied this as we go along. So, the first thing is we're looking for a new opportunity or an overlooked need. I will point out that in the value proposition statement I've given you, it's customers have a problem. Often commercial success comes from customers are missing out on an opportunity, right? So the problem can also be stated as an opportunity. One of the things we talked about last time is innovation and entrepreneurs. One of the things an entrepreneur is doing is recognizing the opportunity, recognizing the ability to come in and make it a change. As we talked about in the Accuray case model, case study, the need was there for a low-cost, easy-to-use, high-performance flow cytometer. The market was ignoring that opportunity. It was recognizing that opportunity that was a part of the commercial launch of the company. So the hypothesis here is the value proposition statement. Testing it is we're going to do a lot of asking. As I mentioned in the last case study, I personally did over 80 interviews, and we did lots of surveys on top of that. We did a lot of asking to understand who our customers were, what they saw as the problem, whether they thought our solution was a good one. These are the sorts of things. This is the way we're doing our experiments in the scientific method in this venue. Then after we do our experiment, we're going to collect our data and we're going to analyze it. And we're going to figure out whether or not it fits our hypothesis. You'll see in the case study that I've already presented and case study I'm going to present in the future that going back and looking at the value proposition after you've collected some data is essential. That if you don't do that, you're going to fail. So in the case of the Accuray cytometers case study, we initially were looking at this technology as something that could be used in an industrial setting. And when we went out and asked, we discovered that either the customers already had a solution to that problem or the customers didn't care about a solution to that problem. In which case we could have built a product for them knowing that they had a problem and they really should get a solution to it, and they would have not cared. And a major challenge we face in commercializing technology is not building something that people don't care about. That happens a lot. That's a major cause of failure for innovation. And again, as we talked about in the case study last week, when we went out and talked to people, found out that they were not interested in this. We looked at other applications. We looked at water safety, and we looked at research tool. And we found water safety, again, we weren't getting anywhere with that, but when we looked at the research tool market, we found a lot of excitement, and we modified our value proposition statement to fit that market. So we're going to go around in a wheel. If we take the scientific method wheel and we replace that with the value proposition, this is what we get. We start out with a hypothesis of value proposition. We move to customer discovery, and we're going to talk about customer discovery today. Basically, it's market research. We're going to analyze our data, and then in the business world, we do a pivot rather than just sort of changing our hypothesis. It's a very sophisticated term, pivot. Okay, so Richard Feynman has a lot of things to offer here. Physicist, but he had some things to say about theories. He says, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, and it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, if the data doesn't match, it's wrong. And there are a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators who are trying to squeeze what their view of the world. They're convinced that people have a problem and that this is the solution. They don't match that up with the data, and they keep driving forward. And the world is not forgiving of that. In the end, what you end up with is something that no one cares about, and you fail. So do not build or fix something that no one cares about. That is a take-home lesson for the class today. I hope you can all remember that. I put it in bright green letters so that you'll remember it. I don't know if that actually works. That's your number one goal. Okay, so let's talk about customer discovery. As I mentioned, this is the element here where we're doing experiments. We can also talk about this as primary market research. We're actually going out and talking to customers. And it is the bedrock of successful ventures. In its most complete form is a process of gathering the data on all the stakeholders. I see you laughing. You had a lot of stakeholder work, and you were part of. You did an I-Corps program, yeah. So you would be familiar with this. Have you named your company yet?
We had to change our name.
Because it was taken by somebody else?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. How much time did you spend on coming up with a new name?
Too much.
Yeah. Okay. So this last, as I mentioned, I've been involved in the creation or co-creation of 6 different companies, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about what the name of the company is going to be and arguing with my co-founders what the name of the company should be. And the first time around, this seemed very, very important. And as I got further and further in, it seemed less and less important until I realized that it had very little importance at all, as long as we didn't get something awful. And that was much more important was spending all of that time and energy, instead of thinking about what the name of the company is, was going out and collecting more data to make sure that our value proposition was right. Because otherwise the company wasn't going anywhere. So when we talk about stakeholders, so who are we going to interview? We're not going to go into details on the ecosystem in this class, but there's end users. So let's just talk about the flow cytometer system. So we had end users. We had people who are at the bench using the flow cytometer. They might be graduate students. They could be technicians. They could be postdocs. Those were folks that they had to like it. They had to be excited about using it, and they had to know how to use it. It had to be easy for them to use. Otherwise, we weren't going to be able to bring home our value proposition to the end user or to the purchaser. It had to come from the end user. We also had to deal with influencers, and sometimes these could be either end users or they could be, for instance, faculty member who wants to have a product and would like to have one in their lab, can't afford to have one in their lab, but could if they went in with a couple of other labs, and we wanted to have them excited about it. We recommender and decision maker, usually those were going to be the same individuals in a lab setting for a research tool, so that was going to be the PI. The PI might be the payer, or it might actually be part of a grant application. And so having something that was priced to fit into a grant application so that the granting agency would provide the capital in order for the decision maker to buy it. In our case, fortunately, we didn't have to deal with a lot of saboteurs, but generally, if you're doing something that's going to solve a problem and it's going to have a value, you're going to ask people to change the way they do things. And human beings don't usually like to change the way they do things. And one of the ways they resist that, they stay with the inertia, is they sabotage. There's some reason why this is not a good idea. Sometimes, if you're innovating, you're actually changing the way people do things in such a way that a job might cease to exist. The people that have that job will think it's a bad idea, generally, to make the change. This can come up in a number of environments, sometimes surprisingly so. I've talked to a number of innovators who have ideas about how they're going to change the way healthcare is provided. And the way they're going to change makes a lot of sense to them, but it's going to take money out of the pocket of physicians who are currently providing that service. And it maybe is not a surprise if physicians have a dim view of that approach. And that could be maybe based on the fact that they don't want to have to make that change. It could be because they know a lot more about delivering health care and don't think it's a good idea to make that change because they know what the consequences of it would be. In one case, that's I wouldn't call that a saboteur, but in another case, we don't want to make this change because we have this system works pretty well for us. We'd like to keep it. Generally, if you want to make a change in the way healthcare is delivered, you're going to have to get a professional society to get behind you. If you're going to do something that's going to weaken that professional society, regardless of how people think that this might be a good idea, in the end, that professional society might not come out and back your change. And if they're not backing your change, you have a saboteur or resistance. It'd be very difficult. We talked about that a lot last time, how the industry may think that making a change sounds good, and they may say that that sounds good, but if it's actually going to change their bottom line, they may find ways to work behind you to inhibit, put regulation in place so that you're not able to operate in the way you want to operate, or find some other way to slow you down. So you need to anticipate who might be hurt by the change that you're proposing and identify whether or not there's a way to anticipate that and get around that, or find a win-win solution. But generally, you want to try to avoid being bushwhacked by that. So, in the end, you need to talk to all of these folks and collect data from all of them to find out what's available. So, in the I-Corps program, they're going to recommend that you talk to 100 customers or do 100 interviews. That's a lot of interviews. In Accuray, I didn't even do that many interviews. I will say that once you get into the tens of interviews, you tend to find a trend, and the second half of the 100 is probably confirming that trend. But it is definitely, we'll talk about some of the things you shouldn't do when doing your interviews, but I will say that if you do 5 or 10 interviews, you're probably going to get the answer you're looking for. So you're going to need to go beyond that. And you're going to get to 10 interviews and say, wow, everyone I've said, they all like it, so I can stop now. Okay. So one of the challenges that I have faced and a lot of folks face is, okay, great, I want to do these interviews, but I don't know how to do the interviews, and I don't even know who to interview. How do I get these interviews? How am I going to find people? So the answer is all over the place, and innovators and entrepreneurs have to be creative in this. If you're in the market research space, you would already have lots of vehicles set up, but you would know that what it does is it's a lot of hard work, and it takes creativity. The things that are in here that are on this list. So friends and colleagues are a terrific way to get started. As we'll talk about later, you have to be careful with friends because they'll tend to tell you what you want to hear. Colleagues generally won't tell you you're a fool. because they have to work with you. LinkedIn and other ways to make links between people, whether it's social media or otherwise. Conferences are a good place. You can look at lists of speakers, people who are giving posters, and even attendees. So if you were doing something in blood and you were able to get to the ASH meeting, and you could get a sense of, you could either go to posters and actually talk to people, or you could see who was on the list. Those might be people you want to contact. Same thing with journals. You can be looking at authors of publications. In some cases, I've seen editors turn out to be a good source of information. If this is something that impacts their field, they actually want to hear about it. And they can help you find people to talk to. Cold calls work, and I recommend to this audience that if you're going to do a cold call, play the student card. So we have a project, I'm working on it, I'm just a student, I'm a resident, I'm a graduate student, I'm a postdoc. Don't charge me for the information that I'm asking you for. Please find some time to talk to me. I will say that generally people will say yes if you use that approach. Okay, so how are we doing so far? Any questions? You guys can interrupt me anytime if you want, just like we did last time. If you have any questions, just raise your hand. We can stop anytime. Okay, so now I wanted to go through some tips for customer interviews, particularly early customer interviews. I will say that we can talk about things that can happen later on when we're looking for more volume, but this is really focused more on the stage that you guys would be in with an innovation, and you're trying to establish the value proposition and find out the truth of it. Is the assertion going to hold up when it faces the market? So I showed you this slide last time. I'm going to show it again. The most important thing here is to listen. I will say that the more common action, and I am totally guilty of this. In fact, it was during Accuray interviews that a colleague of mine really kind of showed me the difference between what I was doing here. I'm so excited about sharing the innovation, sharing the new idea, that you really doing a demonstration, or you're selling the idea. You're trying to convince the people that you're talking to that it's a good idea, as opposed to finding out whether they think it's a good idea. And that doesn't work. It may appear to work. They may nod and smile and say, that sounds good, and then you walk out saying they loved it. And in fact, you loved it, and they just nodded and smiled. This is actually a really common problem. I know of an innovator at the university who's struggling with this problem right now. They are convinced that they have a great idea, and it turns out we can't find any evidence that the rest of the world thinks it's a great idea. But they talk to somebody, they come back saying they loved it. But we can't find any evidence that that's true. This was a question that came up in the last talk about there's two different kinds of interviews here. So we can be talking about an informational interview or an opinion-seeking interview. And I mentioned that I had done both. The informational interview, we're really asking people about what they do. We're not going to tell them what our solution is. We're not going to tell them how great our specifications are or how clever it is or show them a picture of it. We're really asking them, so you use a flow cytometer, so tell me about how do you get started using a flow cytometer? Well, I go over to it and I turn it on. Okay, so how long does it take for it to warm up? What kind of experiments do you run on your flow cytometer? What reagents are you using? So what colors are you looking for? And we're just asking questions about how people work with it. What do you do when you turn it off? Does it need to be cleaned? Do you clean it? How often do you get service on it? We're not talking about what our system can do. We're not talking about our system is easy to use. Our system actually cleans itself. We're not going in. We're trying to establish what it is the world sees in their current situation. Now we're going to take that information and apply our value proposition to it and say, do we see the problem in what they do, and do we solve that problem? Right? The other one is the opinion seeking, and that one is generally usually not the first interview. We're going to be saying, here are the specifications of our product, or here's the performance capability of our product, or here's a beta model of our product. What do you think of it? Right? So beta testing is all about opinion. Right? What do you think of it? Did you like it? Was it easy to use? Both of those types of interviews are ones that you need to do. It's difficult to do them in the same interview, and you have to be careful about that. You can have a section of an interview that's informational and a section that's opinion seeking, but you want to be careful that you don't mix them up, because what will happen is you'll get back into this. Right? And so instead of collecting information, you're going to start talking about all the cool features of your product or innovation, or how it's going to save patients a lot of time, or it's going to save physicians a lot of time, or it's more accurate. So you're going to be doing a lot of this, and you're going to be missing out on collecting the unfiltered data. Another way to help with the making sure that we're not filtering the data is to script questions ahead of time. It's something that allows you to get started with an interview quickly and in the direction you wanted to go, to not get sidetracked. It also, if you sit down and write out the questions you're going to have, there's a couple of things you can do. One, you can share those questions with your colleagues ahead of time and decide whether or not you're asking the right questions. And two, you can share the questions after the fact with investors and say, these are the questions we asked. Here's a report that we got. Here's what they said. Right? So it's helpful to have that. I will say that it's important to not let the script block an opportunity, however. We're out there trying to discover, right? So scientific method, we've made an observation, we have a hypothesis, we're running an experiment, we see something we didn't expect, that counts as an observation. We're going back to the beginning again, right? We're going to chase that down. So when somebody says, yes, but I never use it on Tuesday. Well, why would you never use it on Tuesday? Well, because that's when the engineer is not around, and we can't count on it working when the engineer is not around, right? There are things that you're going to run into that are unexpected, and it's a bit of an art to identify which are the ones you need to chase after, but you need to be ready to go off script. The script also helps you when you've gone off script to get back, right? So you're going to take a sidetrack, but then you need to get back to finishing the interview. So having those questions to refer to, you can keep track of where you are. The format of the data collection matters a lot. So generally you want to be speaking to one person in a session if you can. It's not the most efficient way to go, but it's important because that way the other folks, if you bring in multiple folks, they start to influence each other and change what their answers are going to be. Face-to-face interviews are the best for this stage, definitely. Again, face-to-face interviews are not going to be the most efficient, right? So you're using all of your time on one person to get one data point. So N of one. But you do have the opportunity to go in depth with that person, and you also have the opportunity to catch something that you would not have caught in a larger, more efficient format, and to go off track, to go off script if you need to. Phone interviews are often required, but we would call that a distant second. We prefer not to do a phone interview if we can. You pick up a lot of things from sitting in front of someone and talking to them, especially almost all these cases I'm going to recommend that you're interviewing somebody you don't know, right? And if it's somebody that you know well and you're talking to them on the phone, you know what hand gestures they're making, you know what face they're making by just listening to their voice. But if it's somebody you don't know, you're not really picking up on the other cues that would be there. Emails, surveys, and focus groups are all important tools. I have on here to avoid them, not because they can't be useful, but in this early stage, we generally want to be doing a lot of one-on-one conversation. It's the case that if you need to collect a lot of data, a survey is a terrific way to do it. So if we're going from qualitative to quantitative collection, the survey is terrific. You can survey 600 users of flow cytometers, and you can do that in a week. Usually costs some money and some effort, but you can get that data back. And in surveys can be very helpful if you know a particular question you'd like to ask. So do people really need a red laser? Well, why don't we ask 600 people if they use a red laser? We are simply collecting that piece of information, right? So do they use a red laser? We know exactly what it is we want to ask, and we want to ask as many people as we can. We can do that over email. We can do that with a survey. So they are very useful tools. But of course, in that case, we've already decided what the right question to ask is, and we're not getting any feedback as to whether or not, yes, it's true we use a red laser, but. You don't hear the but when you're doing a survey or something over email. Okay? And the last point here, again, just to reiterate, try to interview people you don't know. People you do know, two things. One, you're going to tend to interview people that are going to agree with you. Just you surround yourself with people that agree with you, that see the world the way you see that. More often than not, the people that you're surrounding yourself with who are close to you have some things that you're going to agree with. Okay? Whether it's what to eat or the way to treat patients, they're going to agree with you. The other thing is they're not going to want to disagree with you even if they do, because it's impolite and they like you, or maybe they don't like you but they have to work with you, and so they don't really want to have a conflict around things. And the problem there is they're not going to tell you that your baby is ugly. And that's what this is. This is the ugly baby slide. Innovators are very excited about what they've created. It's their baby. It's hard to tell them that, I don't think it's going to fly. It's very clever. It's definitely new, but I don't see how that's going to work. It's hard to tell people that. And folks do not want to tell you that they don't think that that's a great idea. However, when you're doing the discovery process, that's the time to find out if your baby's ugly. And there's almost certainly something about it that's not quite right. And this is the time to find out. Not after you've built it, not after you've manufactured it, not after you're trying to sell it and you can't hit your sales numbers because your product doesn't really excite people. The time to find out is now, when you can still make the change. Right? Yes?
Do you use any specific strategies or a type of language when you talk about your idea to kind of
yes.
encourage them to be more comfortable giving you critical feedback?
Yes, in fact, I'm going to talk about that in the next slides. One of the things that you're looking for here is you want to think about how your questions, and again, I'm going to mention this here in an upcoming slide. Open-ended questions are a great way for somebody to be able to slide in the but, right? So you're going to want people to not just agree with you. You definitely don't want to just say yes, just say no. You want them to put their words in, because if you're doing a face-to-face interview and you're opening up so that their words are coming in, and you are willing and interested to find out whether your baby is ugly, you'll hear it. You'll hear a little hesitancy, and you'll be like, so I'm gathering that it's not exactly what you thought. So how could this be better, right? Another way to hear that is to do interviews with a partner. right? So there are a number of reasons for that. I see several of you taking notes. Right now it's hard to look at the screen and take notes at the same time, right? It's hard to conduct an interview, to have a list of questions and make sure those questions are being asked and keep notes at the same time. If you're keeping notes and somebody's talking and you're trying to write something down, or you just had an idea and then you're making a little note on the paper, make sure to ask this, or this was different than we thought, there's just too many things to do, right? So having a silent partner taking notes is very helpful. It's also easier for that person to read body language, what's going on. And also, they can hear things that you miss. You're asking a question, you're focused on staying on script, on making sure that you get through all the questions, and you just missed that there was an opportunity to go off script in an important way. And they can say, basically just raise their hand and say, why don't we just follow up on that for a minute, right? Also, when you get lost as an interviewer, they can help you find your way back. So this is the open-ended question item here. So we want to start a conversation. We are going to have a script. We have questions that we want to have answered, and we want to make sure that we get through that as much as we can. I will say that the script changes all the time, right? So we're going to go out and ask a set of questions. We're going to get back answers. It's going to turn out a lot of those questions nobody really cares about. You learn that you don't care about the answer to that because it's not going to make any difference about how you design your product. And there are going to be things that you went off script and discovered there's a lot here we didn't know. We had no idea that there was a regulatory process around this and that we're going to have to fit that. We didn't even know that the nurses all did things this way. We had no idea. We just assumed it was that way. So now we're going to have to change the questions we ask. That's one of the advantages of going off script. It's one of the advantages of letting the interviewee speak. Sometimes the interviewee wants to talk a lot. They're happy that someone's there to talk to, and they want to talk to them. And you may be getting a lot of information that's not all that useful. That's part of the process. Don't try to squeeze the next interviewee down into yes and no questions so that you can get out of there because the last interview talked your ear off. Don't do it. It's tempting, but don't do it. Okay. This next recommendation gets back to the idea, harkens back to this idea of that we have an informational interview or we have an opinion interview. And we do want to try to investigate what people do, and that's often more revealing than what they think. Right? So a classic example of this that will date me already would be the iPod. If you went back to the birth of the iPod and you asked people how could they make their mobile music listening experience better, they would tell you a smaller Walkman with batteries that last longer. Right? It wouldn't have occurred to them that they could stick all of their music, not one cassette, but all of their music into a little box. And that would be a much better solution. So you could understand about designing the product, designing what an iPod is going to do, by understanding what people are trying to do with their current behavior. So that's looking at what they do rather than relying on, we could have a focus group. How would you like to listen to music? How would it make it better? And they'll give you all kinds of ideas that really don't have anything to do with the innovation that you're coming up with. Folks are not always good at predicting what they want. One of the problems, and this is why we need to get back to the opinion collecting portion of the interview, or interviews that focus on opinion, is because folks will tell you that they really, really want this. And then you produce a beta prototype of it, and they don't really, really want it. Investors are generally scarred in this area and have the experience that I know people want the product that you're talking about making when people start paying for the product that you're making. And I hear innovators, so you talk to investors and they say, I have entrepreneurs come in all the time that show me this market report that says people really, really want this. And I've seen that so many times and then seen business plans fail, seen enterprises fail, because it turns out people said that, but that's not really the way they behave. Okay? So we want to listen to what they do and try to interpret that ourselves. We want to ask their opinions, but we need to be careful about that. And then we need to, in the end, put material in front of them that they can actually give us a thumbs up or thumbs down. You're probably familiar with this idea of 5 whys. You keep asking why 5 times, and you get to the truth of things. For those of us who have ever had a toddler, we get familiar with this. But that's how they learn about the world. Why is the sky blue? You can start trying to explain that as a scientist, and they just keep asking questions to the point where you don't know how to answer them anymore. One of the ways to get to understand, is my baby ugly, is to elicit answers and have people go deep into, yes, I would like that. Well, why would you like that? Because of this. Well, why is that important to you? Well, because it's always, we have to do this. But why do you do it that way? Right? So keep asking why. It is an open-ended question. Right? So remember, I'm advising you to ask open-ended questions. This is a good example of an open-ended question. It's one word, why? And there's no, you haven't given any directions at all about how to answer the question, right? The interviewee has to decide for themselves what you even mean by asking why. So that's a good tool. Another way to get at the is my baby ugly, or other information that you haven't known, for those who know who that character is, who's famous for ending his interview with suspects in a crime and saying, just one more thing, and then sticking it to them with the really important question. I like to end interviews with, is there something that we didn't ask that we should have asked? You'll find out a lot of interesting things with this question. Your next questionnaire tends to change as a result of asking this question. Right? There are going to be things that the interviewee thinks of during the interview process that they're not going to share with you because you haven't asked them that. Right? So asking this question is a good way to capture that information. The last thing that's a tool we use in market research and in the customer discovery elements a lot is we want to extend our network. So I like to, the recommendation is don't walk out of the room until you get 3 other names of people you can talk to. You don't always get 3 names, but you want to try, right? So particularly when you're talking to folks who are expressing interest in what you're doing. Okay, so you got a new flow cytometer, you're talking to them, they're really excited about it. Remember I talked about folks pounding the table? They were like, when can I try this? I really want to do the beta test. They're enthusiastic about what you're doing, so then they're very receptive to, in the moment, saying, well, yeah, you could talk to my colleague, or I can introduce you to, or I can do an email introduction. So when you get back to that original problem of, okay, but I don't even know who to talk to. How could I get them to give me, they're busy people, how do I get their information? This is a way to do it, is you're in the room, they're interested, you have their attention, and you're asking a very small thing, which is, can you give me some information about who else I could speak to about this? Okay, so when you walk out an interview, you immediately start forgetting the things that happened in the interview. It's helpful to have a partner who is taking notes. Even when you have a partner who's taking notes, you guys are forgetting what happened. If the interview has gone well, it's moved along at a good pace, there's a lot of interesting information that was passed back and forth. Two people talking to each other can exchange a tremendous amount of information in just a few minutes, right? You may be able to capture all that in writing, but there's going to be nuances in there that you're not going to get. So what I really like to do is when I'm doing an interview with a partner, as soon as we can get out of earshot of the interviewee, we sit down and we talk about what we just heard, right? And what are the things, did you get this? Yeah, I definitely got that. And well, what about this? Yeah, I wrote that down. Yeah, but did you write down this part of it? Because I think that's going to be really important. And your notes blossom, right? So they bush out as a result of this. So you want to capture these insights while they're still fresh. The other thing is you'll start to distort your memory of the interview pretty quickly after the interview. And you're going to distort it generally in the direction of it went better for you than you thought it did. So as much as possible, if you can work through the notes and the observations that you had in the moment, and then when you go back, you'll be reviewing your contemporaneous thoughts. Okay, so that's collecting data, and I'm happy to answer if there are any more questions about how we collect data. The next step in the process is data analysis. So we're going to be looking for patterns in the data. We're interviewing, yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick question. How long should an interview last? Like 10 minutes or an hour or somewhere in between?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have a recommendation on there because it's all over the place. It depends on who you're interviewing, what you're interviewing them about. Are we doing an informational interview or trying to understand what their day is like? That's usually not going to be something you're going to do in 5 or 10 minutes. You're going to generally be asking for 20 minutes of somebody's time to do that. If you have a concept that you want to put in front of somebody, you can get a lot out of 10 minutes of conversation. Sometimes you can't get more than 5 minutes out of somebody. You'd like to have an hour. Sometimes you can get an hour. Sometimes, and I'll say this, I often ask for, can I have 10, 15 minutes of your time? All right? I'd like to take you out to coffee. I want to ask you a few questions. And we'll be there 90 minutes because we've hit on a topic that the person this is a pain point for them. And they really would like to see a change, right? Or it's something they really care about for some reason. And they are going to push off their next appointment to stay with us because they care about it. Usually if I can get in the door with, 15 minutes, I'll get that hour if it's warranted, right?
And then as a second question, do you offer remuneration? So like in your description you said, oh, can I take you out for coffee? And so should that be sort of a way to set up the interview or to offer remuneration for their time?
So we're all over the place in the world. So you're going to answer that question. Does that professionally. So sometimes you can get interviews and they don't cost you anything. Often if you're in a profession and you want to get the opinion of a doctor or a lawyer, they charge for their time. And if you want to get an opinion on whether or not this new drug is a good idea to develop or how they treat their patients, you're going to have to pay for that. Playing the student card is really helpful there. You can generally get away with no cost other than maybe offering to buy coffee. If you're doing things and you're not a pharmaceutical company, you're not a medical device company, but if you are going to expect to have to pay for these things. When you hire, generally if you're hiring a market research company, we have a member of that industry right here, you're going to be paying them to provide information for you, and they may have to be paying to get that information. So information is power, and it costs money. All right. Other questions? Okay. So, yeah.
Do you recommend sharing the notes back with the interviewee just to confirm you heard things right?
I do. I don't really share the notes with them. I'll often ask questions about. So let me just make sure I heard this right. In the moment when I'm finishing up the answer to a question, or it wasn't really clear that, or there's an assumption I've made about the world, and maybe I'm in an informational interview where I'm asking about how they do things, and I secretly have an idea about how things are done and why it's all screwed up, and I'm looking for confirmation of that, and I haven't quite got it. I might say, so would you say then that, your flow cytometer is unreliable? They may not have said that, but it's an opportunity to get them to tell me that or confirm. And that's coming at the end of when I've already think I've heard that. I'm just trying to sew that up. A lot of times we have answers that are multi-part, and we need to be able to make sure that we got what they were saying correctly. So that I do a lot. I generally don't say, okay, would you agree with, what I wrote down, if that's what you're asking. How about you? Do you review the notes with your interviewees?
Once in a while we send them back, but I'm not sure how often we look at them.
Okay, so yes, that you typically you're not gonna get the time with an interviewee to have them review the notes. All right, so we're looking for patterns. We have to be aware of bias, so we're in the analysis portion of our loop. We're going to go back to Dr. Feynman. The first principle is you must not fool yourself. The problem is that you are the easiest person to fool. I was given a good piece of advice once that I had to be careful. I get very excited about new ideas that I'm hearing and potential innovations. And as an entrepreneur, I'm very attracted to that. That's like candy to me. The problem is I can get so much into the sell mode that I'm selling myself, right? And it's true that I have often heard innovators say, well, I'm a leader in the field and I can tell you this is really important. And I hear that a lot. I'm like, all the leaders in the field think every idea they have is very important because it's their idea. It doesn't really tell me whether or not it's very important, right? This whole process of going out and collecting data is to find out whether that's true. But it's true also for entrepreneurs. It takes a tremendous amount of energy, effort, courage to go forward and create something new out of nothing. And at some point along the way, you convinced yourself that this is worth doing. There's a reason to be courageous. There's a reason to struggle through when it's not going your way. There's a reason even when you put up an idea and then it got shot down, so you went back to it and we're going to find another way to make this successful. It's because you're convinced there's something there. Often entrepreneurs have to work in an environment where they're going against the wind, that they have to believe in it even when no one else will believe in it. The problem is you have to weigh that against you believe in it, and it's because no one else believes in it. That's why they keep telling you no. So you have to figure out how to not fool yourself. And if you're in this position of being an innovator or being an entrepreneur, you're in a position where you're believing in things, and you have to figure out how to separate a portion of your brain that can listen when folks are telling you, no, it's not really the way you think it is. We have to be concerned about confirmation bias. So this is the idea of be careful about interviewing your friends and colleagues, right? Be careful about those first 10 interviews that all seem to go very well. What you often are doing is you're finding folks to talk to maybe even subconsciously, you've found folks to talk to who are going to agree with you. That's why you went to them. That was the low-hanging fruit. That's how you ended up talking to them. Talking to the folks on, interviewees 60, 70, 80, 90, those were hard people to find, right? You would have talked to them first if they were easy to find. Problem is that you're going to get this that's easily feeds into confirmation bias. You talk to the folks who are easy. You're talking to the folks who already think that this is a problem, right? That's why they were easy to get a hold of. They'll definitely give you some time. So, in this whole process, we've created a hypothesis. We're going on and testing our hypothesis. In the analysis, we have to stay true to that. We want to endeavor to test and not to validate. We talk about validating a value proposition, and we have to let the data do the validation. We want to make sure that we are not imposing a validation on that, right? So you don't want to validate to what you think is already true. Your current assumptions probably have something wrong in them, and you need to let the world instruct you. As I mentioned before, the ugly baby, there's something about your baby that's not quite right, and the time to find that out is when you're out doing your market research. Let it happen. Don't squeeze the data to make it fit your hypothesis. Do the analysis and change your hypothesis based on the data that you're seeing. So I'm going to summarize some of the recommendations here. So, recommended best practices. We are going to turn off the sales pitch mentality. That's hard because you may have to, in the afternoon, go out and talk to investors and be working very hard on telling them why this is the greatest idea and they should definitely get behind it. You may have to be making arguments with a patent examiner about why your idea should, in fact, be patented, why it's not covered by prior art, why you should overcome that rejection. You're going to be in a situation where you have to do a lot of convincing. That's what innovators and entrepreneurs have to do. But in this process, we don't want to do that. We want to ask probing questions. We want to encourage criticism. You've probably heard about this concept of failing fast, right? So if something's not going to work, we want to find that out as soon as we can. We want to ask questions that assume that there's something wrong, and we're going to find it, right? We're going to listen, and then listen some more. We're going to ask why, and we're going to keep asking why. These are probing questions. We are going to rephrase answers to confirm, right? To get to the question about whether or not we're circling back. And we're always going to try to ask for further introductions. On the don't do side, we don't want to be selling our product or service or concept. Now is not the time to sell that to a customer. Now is the time to understand the customer and figure out whether the customer thinks that this is interesting. Later will be time to convince the customer that it is interesting and they should buy it. But this is not the time. We want to try to not talk about our technology as much as we can. So we're definitely interested. Innovators are very excited to tell you about their innovation. But this is not the time to go on about that at length, any more than you need to. Now, if you're in an opinion interview, you're going to have to be giving some details so that you can get that information back. Got to be careful to not turn off our ears. We don't want to ask dead-end questions, right? So yes/no questions generally don't have anything beyond the yes or no. And there's a lot we're not finding out. It's true, we would find out whether the answer to that question is yes or no, but I hope that I've shown you that in this process we want to engage with the interviewee, and we want to get the answers to our questions, but we want them to tell us things we don't know. We want them to tell us the questions that we should have asked that we didn't know to ask. Dead-end questions don't do that for us. Biased and confirmation questions. So do you agree that this is the case? You want to avoid that if you can. You want to be careful to not put words into the mouth of the interviewee. You want to be careful to not set up questions that you're only asking the questions that you're sure you're going to get the right answers to, and you're not asking the hard questions that are going to tell you your baby's ugly. You want to minimize interrupting as much as you can. This is where the silent partner helps. The silent partner is not interrupting at all unless something really stands out. We don't want to interrupt when someone's answering a question and they're taking us in a direction we haven't anticipated. This is the whole idea behind open-ended questions, is we want to be able to let that go. And we want to make sure that we don't miss opportunities to dig deeper. The reason we're asking, the reason we're doing the experiment is to find out the truth. We want to create every opportunity possible to learn something we didn't know before. There's a time for confirming your hypothesis when you've collected tons of data, when you've done all these interviews, and you're going to go out with a survey and you're going to ask these 10 questions that you're trying to get confirmation of what you believe to be true, that you've made a decision to go forward with something and now you want to make sure. So there's a time when you're going to try to confirm that you're going to assume that you know the answer, and now you're going to try to get confirmation of that. But most of the time, in the early stage, you want just to walk into an interview and say, what can I learn here that I don't know? That's what you want to come out. You always want to walk out of one of these interviews with information you didn't know before. Okay. The most important, it's in green text, so you can tell it's really important. One of the most important things we can do here is get out of the building. For sure, you're not going to understand what the world is like unless you go out into the world. It is very easy and comforting to stay inside the environment you're in, to read some market research papers, draw some conclusions about what's going on, and focus back on your innovation. This is a natural human tendency. Getting yourself out of the building, getting yourself out to talk to people that you don't know is really a commandment in this process. You're not going to find out things you don't know unless you go out into environments that you're not in. Okay? So, the truth is out there. You got to get out of the building to find it, but if you do, you'll find it. If you ask open-ended questions, if you accept that your baby could be ugly, you'll find the truth. Okay? And that's it. That's the end of tonight's lecture. So we have any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
So I had a question. So a lot of the customer discovery interview is qualitative data.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you consolidate that into like a digestible slide format that you could share with investors, and then weight the attitudes and feedback from your different interviewees? Do you kind of bin things? X number of people said that time efficiency was a major consideration of theirs, and then weight that appropriately? Is that, do you try to convert it into quantitative data?
Right. So to repeat the question, that's a long question. Basically, if we're asking if we're doing a qualitative data collection, how do we turn that into a quantitative report? So there isn't a simple answer to that. I will say that if we're starting with a list of questions, and we're going into interviews where we have questions in common, we can draw some conclusions we talked to 33 people, we asked them this question, 75% of the time we got an affirmative, and then you might add in some verbatim about what that looked like. It's often the case, so we keep a report when we're out doing market research. We write up a report on every interview. We keep those reports. Sometimes being able to share so we say, this is the way the world is, and they say, how do you know it's that way? So investors will say, I don't believe you, how do I know it? So, well, here's the interviews. And you can actually, we're writing down what people say, and So rather than being quantitative about that, we're just sharing the qualitative information, and people can quickly draw their own conclusions from it by reading it. Those are a couple different ways that if we are really thinking about how do we share the knowledge that we have and reduce that down to a quantitative form. Those are a couple different ways that I've worked with it in qualitative questionnaires. But I would say in the first few dozen interviews you're going to do, you're really not going to be focused on that, other than there may be some specific elements of your questionnaire where you're getting, like, so how many lasers does your current flow cytometer have? 2. So you'd say, 96% of the people we talked to had 2 lasers. Only 13% of it were dealing with an instrument that had 3 lasers. There would be a way to quantify something out of it. That's useful for some element of it, but what's more useful in those early interviews is going to be all the other questions you asked.
Are investors have enough patience to read through many reports, or do you really have to put it into kind of tight language?
Yeah, so we can talk about that as we go forward in the class, a little bit about investors and more. I will say that there's a number of things. So the question is, what do the investors have the patience to go through this information and take in data that isn't just some percentages and numbers, some quantitative data? And the answer is generally yes. So as you get into, not in the beginning, so not in your first presentation, but if they're excited and interested and they want to get into the due diligence phase of it, where they're beginning to, they've made their own hypothesis that investing in you might be a really good idea, then they're going to test that, right? And part of the way they're going to test that is start digging through the information that you have. They'll look through a lot of things, including what's the data that you have to validate this value proposition that we're going to be buying into. Not all investors will. Often you'll have investors who are responsible for doing that sort of diligence and other investors who are following their lead. But good investors are going to do that to some extent. I will say on the flip side, we can look at it cynically too. Sometimes due diligence is, well, we did market research, and they said, well, okay, did you read some market reports? No, we actually went out and we talked to people. How many people did you talk to? We talked to, 150, 200, whatever. And there becomes, there's some element of kind of, well, show me your data, and you put it in their hand and they kind of weigh, that seems like enough paperwork. I think you got it, right? So they may ask questions about what's all in there and how you got it to make sure that that's valid without having to go through every one of those things themselves.